was only sewer. I didn't want to get dressed up for sewer.
Good evening, everyone.
That's the really
Welcome to City Hall. We're going to start tonight with the Sewer Utility District Commission meeting, and can we have a roll call?
Commissioner Strelchuk,
I'm here.
Commissioner Bushy,
Here.
Commissioner Meyer,
Here.
Commissioner Worth,
Here.
Commissioner Giroux,
Here.
Commissioner Hawkins,
Here.
Commissioner Schneider,
Here.
Commissioner Nurbin,
here.
Commissioner Abendroth.
Here. We have a quorum. The first item is approval of minutes of November 14th.
Move approval. Second.
Motion and a second to approve. Is there any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Minutes are approved. Personal appearances. It's a new item for the Sewer Utility District Commission. Any citizen wishing to address the commission on any matter on the agenda may do so at this time.
Related to sewer.
Yeah, we have three people that have registered to speak, and it refers to Resolution 3487, which is our next item anyway. So Ann Herring?
Oh, great. I'm looking for them. That I have. I'm looking for them.
Good evening, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk about the work that's going to be done in our neighborhood. I do want to thank Kevin. I've spent quite a bit of time with him this afternoon, as has my husband, getting information about this project and getting better understanding of it. I personally understand why this project is being done, the work that's involved with it. Both my husband and I have some background in sewer treatment as well as underground utility work, and we've done a little bit of research on it. I think from a safety standpoint, it's a good project to have. We do have other concerns. A lot of it is regarding the verbiage of the agreements that were sent to us. First concern is, of course, safety and quality. I think we personally, I can't speak for my neighbors, but personally we are in good shape with that. Big concern of ours is property damage, potential property damage. With this process, it sounds like we're going to do a jack pipe process for the boring, and that's relatively safe, relatively uneventful. If there's a problem, they can do slip pipe, which means that they can do repairs underneath the ground without disturbing the surface. However, surface damage is sometimes unavoidable, which means them coming in, digging up the ground, ripping up our backyards to do the repair, and that is something that does happen. The verbiage that we have in the agreement, the original agreement, really says that that's our problem and that the city's not going to fix it, and that's something that we would like to have the city take responsibility for. At the minimum, we'd like the property to be in good shape or be left in the situation that it was left in. The condition we're not asking for more than what's there, but if there is work that needs to be done, we do want it replaced. One of the nice things about our neighborhood is it's the foliage. There's a heavy tree line, it's very quiet, it's very private, and that's one of the beauties of our properties, and the property value is important to us. The issue with the property and the compensation, we'd like to understand what formula the city council or the city came up with to get that amount. Our understanding is that that dollar value is based on the easement property alone, and it doesn't include the loss of property value in having a property with an easement on it. Our entire property value will go down if we have an easement, and we want to make sure we're compensated for that. The issues with responsibility of any damage if the sewer fails. In the original agreement, it says that we, as homeowners, are responsible for the maintenance, repair, replacement, or operation of the sanitary sewer. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think maybe somebody put that in the agreement erroneously. It needs to be resolved. I don't know that we can be responsible for the operation of the sewer. The landscape, let's see. And I apologize, I had some notes and I already talked with Kevin about some of these things, so I'm not going to repeat them. I'm sure he'll share that with you. We talked a little about where the lift station location. We also talked about the future. We live in our house now. We may not live in the house 10 years from now. if there is damage to that sewer pipe, repairs need to be done. Somebody needs to bring a backhoe into our backyard and dig up the backyard. What will the new owners be responsible for? Again, this goes back to the request of having the city be responsible for repairing whatever damage is done to the property so that it does not ruin our property values. We want to have a fair agreement with the city. And again, I'm speaking for myself. I do have several of my neighbors here. I also have several neighbors who are listening and interested in these conversations who are unable to be here tonight. We'd also like to have all of our agreements be the same. It sounds like they're doing different agreements for different people. We want to make sure everybody has the same agreement and has the same understanding. That is basically the highlights of what I want to talk about. The property restoration, again, the valuation of the use of the easement, the damage to our property or reduction of our property values because of this work. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Herring. Robert Wagner?
So, hi, I'm Bob Wagner. Thanks, everybody, for the time listening to us. So, everything that Ann said, pretty much on board with pretty much everything they said, just to kind of air my concerns as well. Really, our major concerns are with the use. There's a couple of things that we're concerned with, primarily with usage and access to the land, what we're allowed to do on the proposed easement property. More important than that is what if there is damage to, or if the pipe bursts, for instance, how is the city going to address this? How are they going to fix it? How are they going to access the area that needs to be fixed? That's another concern. A third concern is just maintenance of the land. I mean, obviously, as Ann stated, we live in a great neighborhood, a very kind of, a lot of trees, a very kind of woodsy feel to it that could potentially change the overall makeup of the land and the neighborhood. So the concern on our part is really with, who's going to take care of this area if there's any damage to any of these trees. Are they going to be replanted? Who's going to be responsible for the maintenance? I personally take the opinion of having a shared responsibility with the area. But what if, in the process of putting this pipe in, one of the larger legacy trees on the property falls? Who's going to be responsible for taking care of that? That's one of the concerns. I think most importantly, though, is the compensation factor. I think Catherine, my wife, and I are the newest kind of neighbors within the neighborhood, and literally on day one, Kevin, who has been fantastic throughout this whole process, by the way, but literally within the first week of us being in our property, he was knocking on our door and stating that there is this easement proposal coming to fruition, and he wanted to discuss the compensation and everything about it. He provided fantastic information. He was always open to talking to me. I think I've spoken to him probably about 5 hours in total, and had great conversations from my perspective. He might give you a different side of the story, but he provided great information. We had really good conversations. He provided a lot of information. But the bottom line is that with us, basically within a week of us owning this property, we had the impression and the realization that our property is devalued by the amount, by X amount. So I just want to make sure that the valuation and the compensation are on par with what the proper value of that portion of the land is. And I think that's the biggest deal. I agree with Ann. I think we should have a agreement that is the same across the board with all of the residents that are going to be affected by this. I want specific language. There's some items that I would like struck from the agreement, primarily with responsibility in the case of a breach or a break in the sewer lateral or the sewer line. Who's responsible for fixing it? So there's a couple things that I'm hoping that everybody would work for, but most importantly, as new residents in the neighborhood, having the immediate devaluation of our property doesn't sit well with me, and that's why I kind of sit on the not for portion of of the proposal. So that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. Dan?
Yep, Robleski,
Rob, Robaneski.
close enough.
Go ahead.
Thank you, and I want to reiterate too, working with Kevin has been fantastic, and I've talked with him a number of times and has really been helpful throughout this process. I won't take much time. I know you have a schedule to keep, and obviously neighbors with the rest of the speakers here today, but just wanted to address, from our perspective or my perspective, I understand the importance of the project, the value and the cost that the city is putting into it. Obviously, there's value to residents, outside of our neighborhood. From our perspective, we've been residents there for 6 years now. I've invested a great deal of improving our property, and I think, as this came to fruition, ultimately, we have no choice in the matter. The project is happening. You're using our property. We have no say. We know it's going to go forward. From that perspective, we have confidence and hope that the city is going to work with us in terms of the repair and the damage and the functionality of this pipe in the future, obviously for us as homeowners and for in the future. For future homeowners, from our perspective, we think the compensation is inadequate. I don't think we're trying to be unreasonable from that perspective. Our property value needs to be looked at entirely, not the 12% of the land and 25% of our assessed value of the land. When I sell my property, I'm not selling the land, I'm not selling my house or my garage, I'm selling everything. And so if we're going to compensate based on property value, it needs to be our entire property from my perspective, not just a slice of land that is going to be utilized. Again, this easement's for the life for our property. It'll be there forever, and it's something that we need to deal with. Today, we have one shot to deal with this, and we need to do it right. And obviously, we've addressed with Kevin, best case scenario, the plan is to do the tunneling work and everything as it's scheduled. We also have to plan for worst case scenario, what's going to happen in the future, and that's what we're trying to do. So thank you for the time.
Thank you, Dan. Move on to Resolution 3487, a resolution adopting a relocation order authorizing the use of eminent domain to acquire sanitary sewer easements and the execution of a professional services agreement with Single Source in Brookfield, Wisconsin for the estimated amount of $12,600 in connection with the East Trunk Sewer Capacity Expansion Project.
I'll second for the sake of
Motion and a second to approve. I'll go to our engineer, Mr. Driscoll. Can you maybe address some of the comments that were made here tonight?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you.
With respect to the previous resolution, 3478, we negotiated, the authorization for the negotiation and execution of the easement agreements was approved in November, and that was based on 25% of the unimproved land value for the respective easement area. And the resolution that we have going forward, we're addressing the compensation matter by having appraisals to be able to determine a revised compensation amount. So that was one aspect, was the concern about compensation. Another aspect that I'd like to address to the residents was the responsibility for restoration. While there's the standard language for the easement agreements, each easement is somewhat unique and has some variables, and that's where there's been coordination with each of the property owners to address specific concerns and requirements that they individually may have. So this resolution tonight does not stop the negotiation process or the revision of any easement going forward. So I look forward to continuing a dialogue with the property owners to address the matters of restoration in the event of possible damage. So I believe that addresses the two main factors that I understood with respect to restoration and compensation. Were there any other questions?
I just want to
Commissioner Roy.
clarify that one section that you just mentioned about the restoration. So in the easement agreement as it stands now, it does have a clause for restoring the property related to the tunneling, et cetera, correct?
Yes,
Because there isn't an anticipated much of disruption, but the anticipation is that the city would restore the land to its normal state after this work is done, correct?
correct. There was a language in there that the grantor and grantee share in the responsibility, and some property owners have requested to strike out that the grantor be responsible for any restoration, and that's been acknowledged and signed off on.
And the other concern, which seems reasonable, is we don't expect there to be much disruption of the land in the future because our anticipation is we're going to fix things underground and we're not going to be back there with machinery, et cetera. But, unusual things happen, and I understand their concern about what if we have to go back? And is it usual or unusual for there to be some language in there saying that in the event that we have to reopen this or revisit this site, that I would think that it would still have the language restore it to its previous state?
With respect to the easement language, I would defer to the city attorney on that.
Okay.
The answer is obviously every easement is going to be different in terms of how it's negotiated. The fairly typical and standard easement that's negotiated for these types of purposes, both by municipalities, by gas companies, by all sorts of folks that do underground utility type work, is generally that the entity that's doing the work, the city in this case, will generally be responsible for kind of the bare bones putting it back. We'll backfill, to, so that it's level with the ground. We're not going to make them do that. But the final details are generally left to the property owner. That is to say, you want to tweak the grade a little bit and those types of things. You want to put a special type of grass seed in versus what we, otherwise would throw down. That all typically is left to the property owner because, each individual property is different and you get into all sorts of weird arguments about the fact that, I had, Bermuda green grass on my property and you put in fescue or, whatever. You end up with all sorts of weird things. So the standard kind of agreement is, we'll take care of, getting it back to roughly where it was at, but the final details generally we leave to the property owner, just because it's tough. You put it back and you're responsible for the final grade, and then it becomes questions of, it's a half inch off in this spot, and now water ponds a little bit more, and now you got to come back and redo the whole property. That's something that generally you just put back on the property owner to say, look, you know how the property was better than we ever will. Take care of it, and that's what the standard language reflects. Now, there was some language, as Ms. Herring, was it, had indicated that through a drafting error, there was some indication that there was responsibility for kind of the operation and everything else that was being put on the property owners. That was an error that's been corrected, and something that we're looking at. But that's kind of the norm. Now, anything above and beyond the norm is obviously subject to further discussion. There are also differences from property to property. In most of the cases, we're dealing with fairly open land that is just being tunneled under. There are some instances where maybe you're tunneling under an existing fence or an existing shed that's in the backyard or something like that. Obviously, those are different circumstances that need to be addressed in those cases. If there's a shed that's in the easement, either we're paying for the shed now or we pay to replace the shed should it be, disturbed in the future. Those are the two options that typically exist. But, we wouldn't put that, for example, in all of the agreements because we don't have sheds on all of the properties. So, those are the types of things that we're looking at.
But what about revisiting the site in the sense of a disruption in the sewer system that requires revisiting the site? Is it common to put language in about restoring the property, at least bare bones, or is that usually not part of the easement?
No, that is typical. I mean, anytime we would go out on the property and disturb that property, within the easement area, we are responsible for, whatever standard is set, be it, the standard language being just kind of that bare bones, putting it back, and that's what we would do. So, for example, you have a burst pipe that occurs and we need to go in and dig it up in order to make the repair. Part of that repair process, whether it's today, tomorrow, 100 years from now, whatever the case may be, involves, going in, repairing the pipe, and then backfilling appropriately, consistent with standard practices, and putting it back to the standard that is agreed to as part of that easement. So,
Commissioner Worth?
I hope that the easement is being reviewed so that it has the fair meaning that you just described. Because I'll tell you, I've seen a lot of easements that aren't fair. Besides the fact that we're doing something on the property owned by these individuals, generally putting underground utilities doesn't diminish the value of property, other than it diminishes the use that can be made, the permanent use that can be made above that easement. So you're not going to be able to put a shed probably in that easement area. I mean, I review 100 title policies a year, commitments. Every one of them has almost some sort of underground utilities. It hasn't changed the value of the property. In fact, nobody knows that until after the purchase price is negotiated. You don't ask to see the title while you're negotiating the purchase price for real estate. But there is a difference that, there's a path that you're not going to be able to put a shed, and you probably, if you're going to plant trees, you better recognize that someday those trees, if you have electric lines, they're probably going to get torn out if they're underground or cable or what have you. With a sewer, it's less likely that you ever tear anything out anyhow. So, but people are entitled to some compensation because there is a restriction on their property. As a practical matter, it's almost no restriction. As a sales matter, it's almost no restriction. But many utilities don't treat people fairly, at least in the document, as far as things like restoration, maintenance, repairs. Sometimes they're just silent, too, unfortunately. I would hope that we recognize that we're not We Energies, and these people are our constituents, and at the end of the day, they ought to be in the same position they were before this process started, other than somewhere underground, they've got a pipe. If their property is going to get affected, or their use of their property, that it should be on the utility to fix that. And that we don't just negotiate the best deal we can, because that shouldn't be our approach to dealing with people who we're imposing upon.
Absolutely. Commissioner Strelchuk.
I just wanted to reiterate what Alderman Worth had said. I agree wholeheartedly, and, the takeaway from each individual that spoke, first of all, Kevin's dealing with a very controversial issue, pipe through people's yards. This is an objectionable thing unless you have some of the details on what's going on, and it still is possibly an objectionable action even when you do. So I'm pleased that each person that spoke complimented you on the communication, and I'm pleased that our residents are being communicated with so effectively through a tough issue. So pat you on the back for that one for sure, and thank you for speaking up and telling us how our staff is doing. We like to hear how they're working with you and make sure that it's an effective communication pattern. The biggest thing that kind of hit home with me is when Mr. Wagner was talking about devalued land. When you have an easement and you're paying for a portion of the easement, the value of the land on that easement, you can't sell that easement separately as devalued. You sell the property as a whole. So as Alderman Worth had stated, let's make sure they're at least in the same position that they were in going into this. If the property and the use of the land is devalued, let's make sure that they're accommodated for. We're not We Energies. We're not trying, the word eminent domain, I mean, each and every alderman or each and every commissioner here cringes when we hear the word. We just hate it. Unfortunately, sometimes just to make sure that we have a better utility for the citizens, including the ones that are effective with the piping, we have to act and make sure that the utility can go through and be effective. The bursting issue that came up, I just wanted to kind of mention that as well during the last meeting. If you didn't hear, these are low pressure pipes. If anything, you're at a higher risk of water seeping into the pipes versus coming out of the pipes because they're low pressure, and the water pressure around the pipes would be higher pressure than would be within the pipe. Am I correct, Kristen, in stating that? I want to make sure I'm 100% accurate before I'm on record for saying something. How are we evaluating, the land value? Are we taking the whole land value into accommodation, and we're looking at that as a scope through our negotiations?
The original resolution that had specific dollar amounts was based upon the 25% of the associated land value. The statutory process that we're requesting permission for tonight requires an appraisal to be done on the property and then evaluation completed as to what the effect of the easement will be on the property. Obviously, there's three ways that it could go. That value could be less than, equal to, or greater than what was approved at last month's meeting. After that process is complete, if it was less than or equal to, we're fine to continue the negotiations because we have your authority to move forward with their payment. If it results in an indication that the compensation should be greater than, then we'll return with a resolution requesting permission to offer that, should that be the case, and then likely also request that application across all of the easements associated with the project.
Thank you.
Mr. Worth.
To clarify, I wasn't suggesting that I thought that we needed to up the dollar amount being paid because I think that the value lost generally, unless it's taking away somebody's patio, is nominal or almost non-existent. But I want to make sure that the city's responsibilities under the easement are fair, and that's what I was trying to get at. That we're going to restore the property in a manner reasonably similar to what it was there, not just, we'll come in and we'll rough grade and walk away, because that's what some utilities do.
I don't feel I was making that point, and if you felt I did, I apologize.
I don't know.
That's always been our position. And we're hiring a professional firm with experience in negotiating these types of easements. So, Alderman Nurbin.
Echoing the concerns of the other aldermen about fairness in the repair process, I agree we should do a little better than just filling in the hole. I don't know how we draft language around squishy terms like reasonableness, and invariably there's bound to be a disagreement at some point as to what's reasonable. What would be a resident's recourse if we couldn't agree on what was reasonable? And I agree we should strive to be very reasonable in the repair process and try to restore it to the before condition. I don't want to impose more landscaping work on people in this process. We just want to get the sewer in. But what would their recourse be? Would it be to petition this body as representatives of the utility? And should we enumerate that?
The short answer, the most clear answer is you'd file a claim and say, hey, you've damaged my property, and we've got an agreement that says you're supposed to do otherwise, and that claim then gets presented to the appropriate body for action one way or the other. And if that claim is denied, then that gives rights in circuit court that could then be applied. Obviously, we don't hope or intend to ever get into that situation, in terms of where we're at, but that would be the answer.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to recommend this resolution. Call the roll.
Commissioner Strelczyk,
Aye.
Commissioner Bushy,
Aye.
Commissioner Meyer,
Aye.
Commissioner Worth,
Aye.
Commissioner Garrell,
Aye.
Commissioner Hawkins,
Aye.
Commissioner Schneider,
Aye.
Commissioner Nervin,
Aye.
Commissioner Evans.
Aye. That's unanimous, and that resolution is recommended to the Common Council. The next resolution is 3488, ratifying the award of a contract for 2017 sanitary sewer manhole rehabilitation work to Musan Brothers of Brookfield in the amount of $71,685.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, call the roll.
Commissioner Bushy,
Aye.
Commissioner Meyer,
Aye.
Commissioner Worth,
Aye.
Commissioner Garrell,
Aye.
Commissioner Hawkins,
Aye.
Commissioner Schneider,
Aye.
Commissioner Nervin,
Aye.
Commissioner Evans,
Aye.
Commissioner Strelczyk,
Aye.
That's unanimous, and Resolution 3488 is recommended.
Move to adjourn?
Second.
Motion and second to adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We are adjourned. We will now convene as the Common Council. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Roll call.
Alderman Strelczyk,
Here.
Alderman Bushy.
Here.
Alderman Meyer,
Here.
Alderman Worth is temporarily absent, Alderman Garrell.
Here.
Alderman Hawkins, Alderman Schneider,
Here.
Alderman Nurbin,
Here.
Mayor Abendroth.
Here. Alderman Worth is here. We have a quorum. The first item on the agenda is public hearings. Ordinance 1503, amending the city zoning code regarding residential use regulations in Section 58301, Town Center zoning, Section 58302, arrival corridor zoning, and Section 58303, specific development standards. This was recommended by the Planning Commission in October. First reading was at the Common Council in November, and a recommendation will be forthcoming later tonight by the Committee of the Whole.
Move to go into public hearing?
I'd move to suspend the rules and take up the last item on the agenda first. That's what most people are here for.
The adjournment?
Well, not the adjournment.
That'd be quick.
A motion to suspend the rules to bring up item 11. No. Bring up item 9, specified unfinished business, Resolution 3480. Is there a second?
I second it.
Okay, motion and a second to suspend the rules. Call the roll.
Alderman Strelczyk,
Aye.
Alderman Bushy.
Aye.
Alderman Meyer,
Aye.
Alderman Worth,
Aye.
Alderman Garrell.
Aye.
Alderman Hawkins.
Aye.
Alderman Schneider,
Aye.
Alderman Nurbin.
Aye.
That's 8-0. And the rules have been suspended. We will now take up specified unfinished business, Resolution 3480, presentation of and possible action on the mayoral veto of Resolution 3480, a resolution approving a contract to purchase a portion of the city-owned property located at 6100 West Mequon Road, as submitted by John Lazinski of Mequon, Wisconsin. On November 15th, I vetoed this resolution because I do not believe it is appropriate to sell the city's civic campus property to a private entity, and professional studies have determined that there is not sufficient parking to accommodate the proposed use. So this matter by statute comes to the Common Council, and I'll look to you for a motion.
I'd move to sustain the veto.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
There's a motion and a second to sustain the veto. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, call the roll.
Alderman Bushy,
passes.
All right, so just to help the alderman, the motion here is to sustain the veto, which would mean that the veto will remain in place, and as such, a affirmative vote will be in favor of that motion, which would mean that you are in favor of leaving the veto stay in place. A negative vote would be that you wish to reject the motion, which would almost by necessity require some additional action after that motion.
Thank you. No.
Alderman Meyer,
Aye.
Alderman Worth,
Aye.
Alderman Garrow,
No.
Alderman Hawkins,
No.
Alderman Schneider,
Aye.
Alderman Nerben,
Aye.
Alderman Stralchuk,
Aye.
5-3.
5-3, the motion passes, and the veto is upheld. We will now return to public hearings. First item is public hearing 1503, amending the city zoning code regarding residential use regulations in section 58301, town center zoning, section 58302, arrival corridor zoning, and section 58303, specific development standards, recommended by Planning Commission in October, first reading at Common Council in November, and recommendation forthcoming by Committee of the Whole in December.
Move to go into public hearing?
Second.
Motion and a second to go into public hearing. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We are now in public hearing. Does anyone wish to address the council on this item?
Move to close public hearing?
Second.
Motion and a second to close the public hearing. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Public hearing is now closed. Wait a second to let people leave. It's rather anticlimactic. Public hearing for ordinance 1508, amending the city zoning code to rezone the property located at 13460 Northport Washington Road from R1 Single Family 5 Acre to IPS Institutional and Public Service, and amending the land use plan designation from residential 5 acre to institutional. This was recommended by the Planning Commission in October. The first reading was at the Common Council in November.
Move to open the public hearing.
Second.
Motion and a second to go into public hearing. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
We are now in public hearing. Does anyone wish to address the Common Council on this item? Seeing none.
Move to close the public hearing.
Motion second to close public hearing. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Public hearing is now closed. Personal appearances and public comment. Citizens wishing to address the council on any matter not on the agenda may do so at this time. If you desire to be heard on agenda items, you may be heard when that item is considered on the agenda. Is there anyone who wishes to address the Common Council on any item that is not on our agenda? Seeing none, we move on to public officials' reports. The mayor has no reports. City administrator?
No report tonight.
No report. Moving on to the consent agenda, which includes Common Council minutes of November, Economic Development Board minutes of October, Finance Personnel minutes of October, Fire Department reports for October and November, Joint Bike and Pedestrian Way Commission minutes of April and September, Mequon Festivals Committee minutes of, well, it doesn't say. Mequon Municipal Water Utility Commission minutes of July and September, Planning Commission minutes of November, Police and Fire Commission minutes of September 7th and September 28th, Public Welfare Meeting minutes of September, Sewer Utility District Commission minutes of September, Resolution 3481, authorizing final plat approval for Highlander Estate Phase 3, consisting of 45 single-family lots within a 111-lot subdivision located immediately south of Brighton Ridge Estates and Knightsbridge Estates between Wauwatosa and Swan Roads. This was recommended by the Planning Commission on December 4th. Also, Resolution 3482, authorizing the development agreement for Ranch Court subdivision consisting of 6 single-family lots located at 2100 West Ranch Road. This was recommended by the Planning Commission in December 4th. And Resolution 3486, authorizing city staff to request a 1-year administrative extension of the State of Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources permit to discharge under the Wisconsin Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. Recommendation forthcoming by the Public Works Committee.
Point of order.
Yes.
May I fill in the blank on F, item F? It's Thursday, September 21st.
The Mequon Festivals Committee minutes of Thursday, September 21st. That's a long time ago.
Move to approve the consent agenda.
I'd ask to remove item 3481.
Okay. Did the Public Works Committee recommend Resolution 3486?
We did.
We did, okay. So we're going to vote on...
We did, yeah.
We're going to vote on the consent agenda minus item L.
Did you get a second? I didn't hear a second.
I'll second, as amended, to remove the item.
Motion and a second to approve the consent agenda minus item L. All those in favor say aye.
Discussion.
You don't discuss the consent agenda, you remove something if you want to discuss it.
That's it. Okay.
You want to remove something?
No. No, in that case.
Sure. Yeah, I mean,
Could be fun.
remove it, then we discuss it, it's easy.
Oh, I see.
That's why I did mine. I'm opposed, I'm in favor of it, I just had some questions.
Ah, okay. Then I'd like to move to remove, it's,
Not the festivals
uh,
minutes.
3482.
3482?
Okay. So a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda minus items L and M.
Oh, I didn't even see that.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Those items are approved. Resolution 3481.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve. Discussion. Alderman Worth.
At the Planning Commission meeting, I'm assuming I should address this to Ms. Tolleson if I could. There was, it was noted that there are some punch list items. I presume within the last week, those all didn't get resolved. It's unlikely, oh, maybe I directed to, I'm sorry, directed to the wrong person. I'm assuming they didn't get all resolved, or they couldn't get all resolved, and yet I'm assuming that we still, despite the approval of the final plat, have the ability to enforce the completion of those punch list items. Is that correct?
That is correct.
That's my question.
There is only one item that is outstanding that cannot be completed this year, and that was the striping recommendation of the Planning Commission. So we are going to request an escrow for that particular item.
Not a recommendation or requirement. Yeah. So, yes, I just wanted to make sure that that was getting done. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second on Resolution 3481. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Resolution 3481 is approved. Resolution 3482.
Your Honor, I need to recuse myself. I, in fact, because it was a consent agenda, neglected to notice even what it was.
Okay.
So I'm recusing
Need a
myself.
motion and a second.
I move to approve.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve. Alderman Bushy.
After the Planning Commission meeting, there was a couple issues that I wanted to make sure are being addressed, and I assume at this point it would be Christine that could assist. And that is, there was mention about the DNR report concerning wells that would be dug and the aquifers hit, and the impact on neighbors. And I just want to make sure that that report is, I see that there's reference to it in section, the water supply 2E, but I want to make sure that that's in here as actually provided back to the Planning Commission, that report is there, just.
Well, they will have to follow, the city has no regulation over well permits, so the DNR will oversee that process. And typically, the only time that drawdown tests are required are for high-capacity wells, but they'll have to do some, the well digger will have to do some testing to determine what aquifer will be accessed to ensure that that they're meeting the terms of the permit.
Okay, I just want to make sure that then that's publicly accessible, that information to all the neighbors.
Yes, but
so
just
that
to
they
be
can
clear
comment.
through the DNR, so they
To the
don't need
DNR,
to
but I
request
mean
those
that-
through the city.
No, but that information should be provided.
Yes.
And then second, this is to developer, which I guess I can send separately as somebody who lives in the neighborhood. Almost everyone I know in there has had, because of the clay soil, has had to reinforce basements. And so that's a concern that was also mentioned by many people, that they would actually like to.
Can you sit a
provide
little
some-
closer to your
Oh,
microphone?
I'm sorry. That because the soil in the neighborhood is so heavily clay soil, everyone, including myself, has had the areas dug out, beams put in, and so just it was a neighborly thing that many people actually mentioned to me, is to let the developer try to get them to look at that beforehand rather than waiting for future homeowners to encounter that 15 years down the road. So that's just, it was a comment that I wanted to add back to the developers who aren't here. So that was it. Thank you.
Any other discussion? Motion and second on Resolution 3482. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Resolution 3482 is adopted. Moving on to Committee of the Whole, a discussion authorizing Ordinance 1503, amending the city zoning code regarding residential use regulations in Section 58, Town Center zoning, Section 58302, Arrival Corridor zoning, and Section 58303, specific development standards. Ms. Tollefson.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Council. At both the September and October Planning Commission meeting, the Commission discussed variations of housing types and building forms in which residential uses in the town center neighborhood should take on. One of the public objectives of the town center neighborhood as a traditional neighborhood development has always been to provide a variety of housing types and a variety of densities. One of the objectives is to, of course, be able to provide customer base for the type of town center businesses that we hope to attract and continue to provide for high-quality design standards. So the text amendment before you addresses the opportunity to allow for single-family residential development in both of the zoning districts. Currently, detached single-family housing development is prohibited in both of the districts. So this modification to both the town center and the Arrival Corridor zoning district do allow for that detached single-family development. We spent some time talking with the Planning Commission about the likely location of single-family residential development. You're likely going to see that on the fringes of the neighborhood, off of the primary arterial of Mequon Road. So we developed a number of design standards related to site layout, architectural standards, and also the placement of those structures. And as part of that process, the recommendation by the Planning Commission is that as single-family residential development occurs, it would be processed through a planned unit development that requires essentially like an overlay district to the zoning there, and it allows the Common Council to review the development proposal as it relates to all of those items I mentioned, architecture, placement, and ultimately the overall density. One of the things we cautioned the Planning Commission as well as I'll state tonight that given where we expect the market would respond for single-family residential development being detached, we're going to want to keep a close eye on where we start to see that form of use occur, because I think in some of the locations where we'd likely to see it happen at the fringe, you wouldn't necessarily want to be continuously alternating a land use. You wouldn't want to necessarily have an apartment development next to the single family. And so I think that's one of the reasons why the plan unit development process will be helpful for us in terms of monitoring that. The other change is specific to multiple family development, and it's specific to the Arrival Corridor. Again, the town center neighborhood is divided into two different zoning districts. There's a lot of similarities, but the Arrival Corridor district is generally from the Wauwatosa-Mequon Road intersection, just approaching the Bunch Rock and Mequon Road intersection, and it's mostly on the south side of Mequon Road. In reality, there's probably only a few parcels left in the Arrival Corridor district to be developed, and I provided a map as part of the packet. But what the Planning Commission's action was really to restrict the scale of multiple family in the arrival corridor. And what I mean by that is we established some design standards. The maximum height for multiple family in that zoning district would be 2.5 stories. There'd be no provision or opportunity for somebody to ask for greater height than that. It also limits the uses to not have a second story separate unit. So essentially you're looking at more of a townhouse, row house type development where an individual unit spans two floors. And then we're also limiting the total number of dwelling units per any building within, if it's a straight standalone multiple family project. So in both cases, we've tried to further the diversity of housing types. I think in any traditional neighborhood, you're going to find a mix of single family, duplex, as well as the apartments. We've furthered our regulations as it relates to scale and building mass and the form in which these units take. And then we've tried to be specific about design standards, and these are some of the things architecturally that we've debated with developers with the recent projects. But we're trying to exemplify what a traditional neighborhood design would look like while maintaining, a distinct character and long-term value. Alderman Worth and I spoke today about some finesse with some of the technical changes in the zoning provisions that we've provided here, and both we can certainly speak to the context of those, but it was our thought that depending on the policy direction, that we can take some additional time between now and January to finesse that code language to make sure that we're being as clear and concise as possible. And I'm open to working with Alderman Worth between now and the January meeting to make sure that the language represents your policy goals.
And recommendation number 3?
Oh, yes. Well, recommendation number 3, and highlighted as part of the map, shows where we have development that's already occurred and complies with the current standards of the arrival corridor district. But once we make these changes, we would make that development non-conforming in its condition, and we would prefer not to do that, and we would prefer not to leave a parcel in between. So our recommendation following feedback from the council on this text amendment would be to rezone those 2 parcels that are hatched on your map to the town center zoning district so that they remain in conformance. I've spent some time with one of the property owners talking about that. I think there's some additional dialogue, and we have yet to reach the other property owner. But the rezoning of that was not actual, while it was supported generally by the Planning Commission, it was not in front of the Planning Commission for specific action. So we've got to initiate that process once we make sure we've communicated well with the property owners.
Alderman Worth.
To what Ms. Tollefson was talking about as far as the language in the ordinance, one of the things that's always befuddled me is when you go to any of our standing committees and there's a ordinance change, the ordinance is in front of us. At the Planning Commission, they get a list of concepts but never see the actual language of the ordinance. Now, I could have done this maybe earlier than I did since it's been in the council packet, but there are some concerns I have the way this is written. For example, and we haven't totally talked these through, so maybe Ms. Tollefson won't totally agree, but planned residential development is a different use allowed in the arrival corridor than multiple family, meaning that it has its own set of standards, and the only standard it has is 16 units or more, which I think an applicant would be entitled to apply for another reserve apartment building, as nice as it is. If one of the things we're trying to suggest is we don't want that on the corner of Mequon and Wauwatosa Road, I think under this, it could be allowed under a planned unit development just as the reserve was allowed. Another issue is our ordinances, Chapter 58, have a variety of definitions already. And one of them is a two-family home. Multiple family means three or more. Single family, and actually the defined term is one family, means one. This doesn't allow for two-family homes, which I think if you're going to put in some condos and side-by-side duplexes, side-by-side condos, which may be nice on some of these properties in the back of them or what have you, there's nothing that enables that in this set of changes. So I think there's some, I'm in favor of the concepts of the ordinance, but I think there's some work that needs to be done on the language in the ordinance, or we may end up with a result that we don't necessarily, that we're not necessarily looking for, and an application that we'd have trouble turning down because they would meet the, general concepts, but not what we originally intended. And I guess the last thing I'd note is, it talks about abutting Mequon Road, that, these residential can't abut Mequon Road. I hope we clarify that a bit, because that could be as simple as leaving a small outlot along the road, or an argument that, well, we're not facing a Mequon Road, we're facing the internal roadway that we built on the property, or all sorts of other things. So there should be some clarification what's intended there. Abut has a variety of definitions if you look it up. So I just think there needs to be some cleaning up of how this is drafted.
Alderman Meyer.
One of them, I'm not against having single-family homes in either one of the districts inside of there. One of the things that, when we originally thought of the arrival corridor, and the reason why we broke it up, was because of the fact we didn't want to have high-density housing inside of the arrival corridor. Subsequently, we have it because of the apartments, because of the reserve, and the reserve looks nice and everything. But we specifically separated because of that. And I'm very disappointed that we would be even moving into that direction to have multifamily, even with the limitations that are put inside here, into that arrival corridor, even farther into it. We wanted to have a slow ramp up into the town center, and we see that the edges of the town center now are getting built more and more, and it looks like this is designated, so we'll do even more of that out. Now, I understand there's only a small portions or parcels, only a few left that we can do that with, but we hear that argument all the time. We've only got a couple here and a couple there, so let's use those to the max. And I think that's what's happening here again. I'd be totally against any type of multifamily that would be encroaching more into the west side of the district, and that's the main reason why we separated these two things, is because we didn't want to have that in the arrival corridor. So I think this language needs to be cleaned up so we specifically don't have that inside of there. I would actually recommend that it goes back to one of the committees. I don't know if Alderman Worth or Public Welfare would like to take a crack at it, but we certainly could do that there.
Alderman Meyer, are you suggesting no multiple family residential development in the arrival corridor? Correct.
I mean, condos, I don't have a problem with single-family homes inside of it. I don't have a problem with, some condos inside of it. But
Well, condos is a form of ownership, so you mean a detached single family would be fine.
Correct.
An attached single family that's two single family units attached, essentially a duplex.
Correct.
Are you also referring to, let's say, a row house that's one building but contains single family homes that are attached up to 4 per building or 6 per building, or, because essentially this
I
takes.
think we need to clean up the language inside of that, and also because of the fact you take a look at this and you see that, there's no space inside that says a 1.5 story building up to a 2.5, and I've never really understood how you get 1.5 and 2.5 heights, and the same thing as when we had the town center at 3.5 stories or whatever. Never understood the concept of that at all. But, and now you're talking about expanding that again to greater heights, so.
This is actually reducing it. Right now.
I understand, but I mean, when we're going through this, I think we need to reduce it even more inside of it for it. So I think the language needs to be cleaned up, not done here, tonight over it.
Yeah.
So I'd recommend that it would go to a committee and then have that come back.
Alderman Strelchak.
I think if this does go to committee, I'm supportive of ownership in this, but I think we really got to wait and see how the apartments take off. We got a lot of apartments coming online, and we're spending a lot of effort revisiting this, and I support the effort in revisiting it. I think it dials it in a little bit better. I support Alderman Meyer's position where in the rival corridor, I don't want to see a lot of multifamily. My thoughts and the vision that was discussed all along on this space was that it was going to be a walkable area with a strong mix of retail, small shops where you could go in and out, supported with residential. What we're getting a heavy load of residential. We've got a couple things that are, in the proposal phase. We've got a couple things that are coming online where we're going to bring back some of that retail. So it's not just MTC1 with retail in the town center district. But I want to make sure that, as we're reviewing this, maybe we look at some of the ratios of what would actually be allowable as far as the percentage ratio of residential versus retail. Make sure that driver for what the vision of the city, that it's a walkable, shopping district, a walkable area where you can go from store to store and you can have that interaction. You can park in one place, walk to several. That we're supporting that vision that we've talked about for so many years. I'm concerned that we're getting away from that, but I do like that we're reviewing, and honing in on the language. I would support it going back to committee if we needed to do that. I don't know what others' thoughts are.
Alderman Worth.
Well, I would like to be clear, and I'm guessing I'm taking what Ms. Tolleson would tell you also. The arrival corridor was never going to be the walkable part of the town center. It was never going to be the dense part of the town center. It was going to have some business, probably more residential than business, where when you got to the town center, that was going to be more of a, and it's a smaller area, or at least it was originally anticipated to be a smaller area, although it seems to want to grow. The walkable area with the shops, some residential in the back, that might have been a higher density residential than the arrival corridor. And my concern is that we've gone to the higher residential in the arrival corridor, and that we really haven't curtailed it here. I think the concept of not having multiple floored buildings in the arrival corridor will lead more likely to condominiums than apartments. Condominium apartments, or whatever you want to call them, aren't selling these days. Regular, side-by-side condominiums are, some townhouse type condominiums are. So if you get rid of the apartment units that are supposedly going to be condominiums, maybe someday you'll have fewer apartments. But we don't have the right to determine ownership.
Right.
We have the right to determine use. Is this residential or not? And so it's a question of figuring out what type of residential we want in that area. I think it's a step in the right direction, what we're doing here. I think we also need to look at the town center. How dense, how many apartments do we ultimately want there? And to Alderman Strelchak's point, yeah, we ought to wait and see what happens with, Town Center 2 and Foxtown and what have you. But we can make the changes now and determine if there's a need in the future or a demand to lessen the restrictions. What you don't want to do is leave it wide open, send a message to developers that you're asking for these apartments, and then when they come in front of you, tell them, no, we don't really want those. I mean, that's what's really not fair. So if we don't want more high-density apartments, we need to make some changes to our ordinances to send the right message to the market. Then if someday we think that having another reserve is a great idea, we can make another change. But the worst thing is to have your ordinance say somebody could do something, and then when they go through the cost and expense and come before the planning commission, say, well, you know, it's a conditional use, or it's only under plan unit development, we're not going to approve that. That's just not fair.
I just have a question, actually. So is my understanding that this, I'm now in recommendation number 3, that the reserve is in the arrival corridor?
Correct.
And is it true that in the arrival corridor, there's not to be multifamily apartment-type buildings as it stands now?
As it stands now, prior to the change, that's permitted. There are some additional applications and approvals that have to occur, including a planned unit development. The council ultimately has currently in the ordinance control over all of these. I think part of the struggle is that has been without specific design standards as it relates to form, that we're not sure how we can consistently apply really what the objective is going forward. So the goal here was to still establish a process that gives the council the ultimate control and authority by approving through a planned unit development projects, but by guiding the private market, guiding the developers up front in terms of what our expectations are about height and massing and number of units. And some of the technical standards that are listed in here, like controlling the height at 2.5 feet and not allowing, or 2.5 stories, and prohibiting stacked units is going to automatically get you a particular type of residential use without us talking about ownership.
So maybe I'm just slow, but what is the benefit of rezoning it to be town center then?
Well, that's the reserve. That's a specific issue. I mean, that's a condition that exists completely in conformance with the current zoning and the PUD. Once we change the standards of that base zoning district that the reserve is currently operating under, it will trigger some non-conforming conditions for them, and that can have some concerns for them for insurance purposes and future adoption of that use or that project.
It would be legal non-conforming.
Yes.
Correct.
But our
It-
general
it's
practice
still
has
a
been to
change.
try not to create those situations. We've even gone back and rectified some that we've created in the past.
Yes.
But nothing suggests we have to rezone the undeveloped portion of those lots. Those are divided, even when you look on your map, those are divided, aren't they?
Well, yes, but it's all regulated by one master PUD.
Right, but we could rezone where there's already construction and not rezone where there has not been construction and not create a non-conforming use and still leave the land that should be part of the arrival corridor in the arrival corridor.
Yes, you could do that. I'd want to walk through those steps
Right.
on that site, given all of the conditions of the PUD first, and then talk to the owner. But that third recommendation is really just trying to protect the investment of that property owner and making sure everything, works for them. It's more of a specific solution that we need to come with.
And that ordinance is before us tonight.
Do you have a recommendation?
I'd move to refer this to the Public Welfare Committee.
So you're going to move to table and refer to public welfare? Because you're going to have to table the ordinance later.
I'll second.
Motion and a second to table and refer to public welfare. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, that item has been tabled. Ordinance 1511, amending Chapter 58 of the Mequon Municipal Code as it relates to stormwater management practices for redevelopment projects. We do have one person who registered to speak on this item, Greg Thompson. Are you still here, Greg? Yes.
Good evening. Thank you for your time. I'm Greg Thompson, representative and project manager for Tom Neiman's Foxtown development. Here to speak in support of Ordinance 1511, the stormwater amendment, and 1512 regarding the zoning for the PUD of the Foxtown development. Our civil engineer, Kevin Parrish from Quam Engineering, did a survey throughout the state of Wisconsin and found that most communities in the region do not impose pre-settlement stormwater requirements on developments. They give credit for existing impervious surfaces, such as parking lots, roofs, etc., which would require 40% sediment control, total suspended sediment reduction. And those areas include MMSD in most communities throughout the state of Wisconsin. So we feel that this would be beneficial to move to existing conditions when looking at stormwater requirements for development of a site versus pre-settlement. In addition to that, the Foxtown development will create a substantially more amount of landscaping and pervious areas than currently exist. So we believe not only will that be a great improvement for the overall site development, going from a brownfield site to a fully developed site with a lot of great amenities, but we can more than easily meet MMSD and all DNR stormwater requirements based on existing conditions versus pre-settlement. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I'll go to our engineers.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So the stormwater ordinance, as it stands today, was adopted in 1999, and as Mr. Thompson mentioned, it is more restrictive than most communities, and that was done intentionally. So in your packet, there are a few memos, one from, I believe, Planning Commission and another from Common Council, detailing some of that decision-making so that you are aware that it was done intentionally. For the text amendment that's before you now, the applicant has requested that a portion of that stormwater ordinance is adjusted for redevelopment sites. So those are sites that currently have a development on them. So in the ordinance revision, you do see a definition for what is a redevelopment site. So it only applies to a portion of developments in the city of Mequon. Specifically, they are looking for a change in the pre-settlement requirements. So right now, if a redevelopment site came to us with a proposed development, they would have to go back to pre-settlement conditions. So that would be a farm field or a forest, that they would have to make sure that their proposed development doesn't discharge more water than that condition. What the applicant is proposing is that they get credit for the impervious surface, so the hard surfaces that are already there, and that they make it no worse than what it is today. So they would still have to do stormwater management. They still would have to meet MMSD requirements and the DNR requirements. So the total suspended solids that were mentioned by Mr. Thompson would still need to be met by a redevelopment site. They would still need to reduce the runoff from their site to the current conditions. They just wouldn't have to add additional stormwater management to take it back to that pre-settlement conditions. So that's a lot of information. So I did include an example site in your packets to kind of walk through what specifically that means. So again, they would still have to provide stormwater management. They just wouldn't have to provide it to the extent to go back to pre-settlement conditions.
Alderman Strelchak.
Well, I'd like to just state that you have the coolest graph we've seen yet. The diagram was nice. It was nice to really kind of put a visual with the concept. I'm very supportive of this. I think that it's a reasonable ordinance coming forward. However, I do have some questions and concerns. The main thing that we've had is we've had some pretty full council chambers with people with concerns on runoff issues on other sites. Lumen Christie, when they came forward, as an example, they did an excellent job. They put a stormwater detention pond in that exceeded what we needed. They did a couple extra things to really kind of improve on that site, to put the neighbors at ease to a known, they have known water flow issues in the neighborhood, whether it was created by LC or not. It's to be determined. Is there anything that we can put in here on the ordinance that would address, like if there's a known water issue, that we could maybe go that one more stringent level? I don't want to see an opportunity to fix a water issue when it really needs to be fixed and it's a known issue.
So we're in a condition where stormwater ordinances apply to all sites. So it's difficult to define what a drainage issue would be. And Lumen Christie is perhaps a perfect example where we were able to negotiate with the property owner for a condition that was more restrictive than what the city's ordinances are. But as an ordinance, we have to establish what the level of restriction is for all sites without defining that it has to be more so for some than others.
Could we put a driver in there that if it's like a super majority based on, super majority objection or something? I mean, I'm pulling at straws because I don't know how to word it. Maybe Alderman Worth could help me out a little bit with the thought process on this. But, if there's a known water issue, you really want to stand behind those residents that, have water runoff and flooding in their homes, or a solid soaked front yard on a consistent basis. In that case, I'm very supportive of the ordinance staying as pre-development. But in this instance, it's very appropriate. There's a lot of asphalt surface. There's no water conditions. None of the neighbors have come forward to object about the water runoff. Everything's been taken into consideration, with, Spur 16 as example there. And there's several easements affecting where a lot of the stormwater can be placed. So,
From a stormwater perspective, some could argue that the reason why some of those drainage issues exist is because the associated developments did not have proper stormwater controls in place. And so by allowing the ordinance to be less restrictive, there is the potential that those conditions would not be improved. They shouldn't be worsened because, again, the control is that it would have to be equal to or less than existing conditions. So they should not worsen under the redevelopment. However, I was not here in 1998, but it appears as though the intent was to essentially retroactivate the stormwater ordinance as redevelopment occurred to require them to put in stormwater facilities that would potentially benefit all of those areas that are seeing those drainage issues. So that would mean leaving the ordinance the way that it is to provide what you're looking for.
I guess I'm looking just for wording to be able to.
You talk about Lumen Christie. When the stormwater management plan was first written, areas that with drainage problems were identified, and like the area around Lumen Christie is one of those. And it was the city's intention to go into those neighborhoods and construct remedies to those problems. The city was going to take on that job, and we didn't do that. We cleaned out a couple of the drainage ways, but we didn't build stormwater ponds. We didn't really correct those issues. And now we have an ordinance that kind of forces us to make a property owner, when they want to develop, do that on our behalf, and that's not fair to them, I don't think. Okay, that's the position we're in today. And also, correct me if I'm wrong, but some state legislators just introduced legislation which would require all municipalities to have stormwater ordinances that comply with state standards. Ours is excessive. So there could be state legislation that makes us do what we're intending to do here today anyway.
Okay, that's fair. I've heard a lot of upset people over the last year and worried about water runoff, and I just, I want to make sure that as we're walking through this, that we're taking everything into consideration.
Right. Alderman Meyer.
My concern was along Alderman Strelchuk's concern also with the fact of having some place that has an excessive runoff right now and is causing problems, that there isn't some kind of remedy that is done on that site when they redevelop. Now, saying that, at least to the point of, I know that when we would be approving something, some development, we wouldn't exasperate the situation that is there for it. And I would assume there would be stormwater management on that site anyway, something that would have to comply to what our standards are.
Not necessarily. The Foxtown development is actually a perfect example that there are 3 thresholds that require stormwater management plans. An increase of a half acre of impervious surface or more, a total land disturbance of 1 acre or more, or at the city engineer's discretion. So typically, those first 2 triggers, there are plenty of redevelopment sites where that could not be met, and depending on how the Foxtown development moves forward, they may not hit those thresholds that would otherwise require a stormwater management plan. It depends on how they come forward, whether they hit that acre of disturbance if they come forward all at the same time, or not, but they will not increase the impervious surface by a half acre or more, and they may not, depending on the
Even with
phasing.
redevelopment of the bus site and that, it's not going to be less?
Yeah, it's all gravel right now, so
Well,
they
it is
won't
gravel, so
increase
it's-
it by a half acre or more.
Explain that, please.
Yeah.
Gravel is.
So gravel is considered an impervious surface. So they won't, in redeveloping that site, add a half acre of
But
impervious
that's the
surface.
first standard. How did they not meet the second standard?
Of an acre or more disturbance. They may, depending on how, they're, at this point, we don't know how the construction phasing will go, so they may
So somebody
hit
could
that
phase
threshold.
themselves out of that.
Well, that's why the third threshold is there, and just so everyone is reassured, the PUD development required a stormwater management plan. So we have addressed that as a part of that, but not every redevelopment site requires a PUD. So we don't always have that mechanism to do so. You do always have the ability to direct the city engineer to use the discretion to require that stormwater management plan.
At planning, I broached the subject of, couldn't we look at the city and determine where there are areas that have greater stormwater problems than others and create effectively districts, having districts that this standard applies because there is not a problem there or downstream, and having standards where there's already a known problem, and therefore in those districts, a different ordinance applies?
Sure. So there are other communities that have a watershed-based restriction. So our threshold is that the runoff has to be equal to or less than existing conditions. We could undertake a study of the city and determine that in certain watersheds, it can't be greater than 0.2 CFS or some specific amount, and then require all sites to design to the more restrictive of the 2. That would be an undertaking of the city to define what those watersheds are and to do some stormwater modeling to determine what the appropriate runoff rate would be for those various districts. But the city could undertake that process.
Well, I'm going to be
if
in
it deemed
favor of this
necessary.
ordinance for now, because I think if you don't want to discourage redevelopment by requiring somebody to have something that's greater than the existing, than just leaving it alone. On the other hand, I think that might be a productive exercise to look at that kind of a concept going forward, and we can always adjust this ordinance after we pass it if we determine that would be beneficial, for certain areas along Cedarburg Road, along Oriole Lane, whichever, and I'm not exactly sure where the pockets are that, may be the most significant water issues, but.
And to the mayor's point, we do have a drainage capital improvement plan that identifies a number of these sites, including, we've referred to several times tonight, the Lumen Christie area, the Ranch Hickory Chestnut area is still on the drainage CIP list. So unfortunately, not all of those solutions are easy or inexpensive. And so that becomes part of the issue in determining how to remedy some of those solutions or some of those situations.
Alderman Urban.
I think this is a reasonable proposal for now. I don't think we want to do anything to discourage redevelopment. I wonder how many redevelopments have been discouraged because of policies like this and others, and if we can pull the line back to something that's more reasonable, certainly something that is more standard for communities in the area and the state as a whole, I think that's a good thing. I'm also acknowledging that there are a few problem areas in town, and maybe the districting concept that Alderman Worth proposes is worth looking at in the long run, but we'll never figure it out tonight or next week or even next
we don't
month.
need to.
And certainly the developments that are most need of, would most benefit this, that are in the immediate future in front of us, don't bear any of those problems that I know of.
Well, I will just note, we do have a flooding issue back here, so that the Spur 16 development will come through this area. But again, it should, under even the revision, they should make that no worse. Under the
Sure, and
proposed scenario, they
it's
just
a
could
it's a
make it
current
better.
condition, we understand it, and we're endeavoring to not make it worse, so I'm comfortable with that.
Alderman Bushy.
One thing I recognize here, thank you for all the information, that there was quite a bit of discussion that went into this in 1999 to come up with that. And actually, in Exhibit B, it did state in here, in their seeking information, that during the development of this ordinance, the Stormwater Steering Committee did seek input from various developers, and the overriding response received back was that the developers wanted a level playing field, and that as long as we tell them what it is required, that they will comply. So I didn't get the impression from here that it was going to thwart development. They just wanted to know what the rules of the game are, and without knowing all the impact that this has, I'm very concerned or having difficulty going in favor of this because of, I don't know what all the impact is going to be. I would like to see more discussion hashed out as far as the impact, and the idea of the zones, I think, makes sense, especially given all the people who have commented even about existing projects like Lumen Christie, that there still are issues there. So I'd be a lot more comfortable with that zoning idea.
The issue at Lumen Christie isn't just the site.
You know,
Yeah, they didn't
put the
cause it.
stormwater in,
Alderman
and
Meyer?
still people are complaining about water runoff.
I am in favor of the project, of the change in the ordinance. I just wanted to make sure that some of those things were addressed, and for going forward. So, I think approval of this is important at this time to do that. The ordinance, when this was done, was kind of done at a different time, at a different era, and I think where we had a lot more stormwater problems. We do have them now still, but I think there was a lot of them at that time, and we wanted to make sure that they were improved as it went along if there was some redevelopment inside of that. So, but I think that no reasonable person would expect that a redevelopment project would go back to the days when there was a field or a grass over there in the same amount of runoff during that time. So.
What is your pleasure? Recommend?
Move to recommend.
Motion to recommend this?
Second.
Motion and a second to recommend ordinance 1511. Any further discussion? Alderman Garrell.
I will probably vote against it. They'll probably do a good job on it, but I don't want to be responsible for the flooding on someone else's property. And on top of that, I think that the same rules should apply to everyone. There shouldn't be special favoritism given to any particular entity. I mean, if we were going to change this for Foxtown, we should change it for the whole city and for all the developers and for everywhere. I mean, making a special
That's what it says.
We are.
for everybody
Yes.
We are.
across the board.
We are.
It's a level playing field.
All right.
We are.
I'll probably still vote against it just because
Just
I don't
because.
believe you.
I don't think that our city engineer is something that she's entirely supports. And secondly, the last thing, that we got flooding over here. You already said we got flooding over here. I don't want to see that. I don't want to see any, and I know this is going to pass anyway, but I have had problems with flooding on my property due to the development, and I understand what happens, and I know it's an absolute nightmare, and nobody takes care of it once it happens. So I'm sure the rest of the Common Council, or a good majority, will vote for it, and that's fine, but looking back on it, I don't want to, I try to vote my principle and vote my conscience. I don't want to be responsible for any of these property owners if this thing fails for any reason, because I don't know who's going to take care of it.
Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Alchak?
I've just got a question. Is there a way that we can, we're going to recommend this or not recommend this and then vote on this tonight, but still request that it comes back forward just for Alderman Garrell's concerns?
It's not on the agenda for tonight.
It requires a public
it's a
hearing,
first
so it'll be
reading.
Yep,
back
sorry.
next
Okay.
month.
It's a first reading.
Sorry, I misread that.
I don't know, this would affect your neighbor. This wouldn't affect a single residential property, would it?
Sure would.
No, they don't have to have stormwater management
Oh,
plans.
that's right.
So this would only affect redevelopment sites.
This would only.
Commercial redevelopment or
redevelopment
commercial and
sites.
residential?
Redevelopment is defined by the conditions on the site, not by zoning.
And let's not forget, the state wants to take away our authority to even do what we're doing today.
Just a quick question. Did we define the definition of impervious and
We don't, that's regulated by the DNR.
it's regulated by the DNR?
No, we don't get
My
Can I just
gravel
ask a
driveway's
quick-
That's
impervious,
just so funny.
Yeah.
Just so funny.
but they get pretty hard. Alderman Schneider?
I'm just curious, so an impervious, is there a difference, or is it just black and white? Meaning, to me, gravel is not as impervious as, say, asphalt in terms of runoff, or are they all?
There are curve numbers, so
Okay.
when they get into the actual stormwater modeling, they are viewed differently. But when you look at an amount of increased impervious surface, there are definitions which, depending on the curve number, also includes turf grass.
So if someone wanted to replace, for instance, a large portion of a gravel surface with asphalt, that would be allowed because they're both impervious?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by allowed, but it would
Allowed?
not result in an increase in impervious surface.
Right. Gotcha.
Worth.
I just wanted to clarify one thing, and what staff said is accurate. This doesn't regulate by use, but it does regulate by zoning district. And so that this doesn't affect sites in a zoning district. It only affects sites in zoning districts outside of agricultural residential. So if you're zoned R1 or R2 or R3, this doesn't affect you unless, yeah, so I mean, this wouldn't have affected, I don't know what Lumen Christi is zoned, is that IPS? Or is that, so,
It's IPS.
okay, so it would affect someplace like that, but it wouldn't affect your neighbor building something. It has no impact whatsoever because I'm assuming your neighbors are all zoned R1, R2.
My point was, I was more concerned, where's the water going to go? And is it going to go toward residential properties, or is it going to go right in the river?
Yeah.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to recommend this ordinance. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
No.
No.
2 noes and 7 ayes. Okay, motion passes. We will now
That'd be a funny looking head.
reconvene as a common council and take up
Be a funny
ordinance
looking head,
1503.
7 ayes.
Do you want to table this and send this to committee? So I don't have to read all this?
Yes. Move to table and send it to the Public Welfare Committee.
Second.
Motion and a second to table and send to public welfare. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That is tabled. Ordinance 1508, amending the city zoning code to rezone the property located at 13460 North Port Washington Road from R1 to IPS, and amending the land use plan designation from residential 5-acre to institutional, recommended by the Planning Commission in October. First reading was at the Common Council in November.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve. Is there any discussion?
Mayor,
Alderman Meyer.
I got a couple of questions. I couldn't see inside of here what the size of the property for rezoning is. Total size of the property is being rezoned?
Perhaps the applicant's 26, there's an expansion proposed, and so some of the additional area and purchasing of
The
property.
total area that's being
Yep,
rezoned?
26.
26 acres.
Mhm.
So, I don't have any problem with expansion and that. My question is on this, is that, now, what type of requirements it gets changed now from residential to the IPS, and so some of the restrictions are taken off of development because of that. And what I mean is that before we've had some senior housing that has gone into an area, I think it was, and they used that IPS designation so that we couldn't control the amount of dwellings inside of the area, and that because they changed that whole zoning classification. Can you walk me through what the requirements would be? And what I'm thinking of is that, 27 acres is kind of, they could, or could they possibly come in and say, okay, now we want to build 100 units of senior housing inside of that area, in conjunction with our church, and then because it's IPS, not be charged taxes and for that. Could they go through and do that?
Well, the zoning district wouldn't dictate their ability to ask for a tax exemption. It would be the use and a certain amount of acreage. And we have addressed that historically when there's been a concern with a pilot agreement, so payment in lieu of taxes. So that's
But it's not a requirement to do a pilot audit.
no.
It comes under an agreement to do that. It's not.
Correct, but it's not necessarily the zoning district that's dictating that. In both the residential zoning district and the IPS district, we don't have technical standards that address your typical development standards like FAR. So the process for these institutional uses or even the larger residential development, which in the institutional district you are allowed to do senior housing, but it's only designated as senior housing. The process for approval in terms of a conditional use grant gives the Planning Commission the authority to arrive at what those technical standards should be.
But would they have, as an IPS designation, would they have that by right to put in senior housing?
No.
No?
No. It's a conditional use grant. Now, there's also bills proposed in terms of modifications to conditional use grant regulations and the local municipality's authority to deny those and what types of reasonable conditions can be placed on them.
I'm
So
not
that's a
against
changing
all this.
dynamic.
I'm just trying to find
Yeah.
out what, moving forward in such a large parcel in doing that, would subsequently what they could do on that parcel besides their normal church functions.
Yeah, and if that's part of the line of questioning or critical thinking that you're doing for the long term, even under the residential zoning classification as a religious institution being a conditional use grant, there are components of religious institutions, like residential uses, that would still technically, from a zoning standpoint, be considered accessory to the other institutional functions that are occurring on a campus, and they may have rights to ask for that even under the residential zoning classification.
So, let me get this straight. So even if it's zoned 5-acre zoning, they would still be allowed to come in and request that they wanted to have senior housing put in that had 100 units in it?
Yeah, I don't know if I want to comment on the 100-unit part of it, but I mean, as an accessory component to more of like a campus institutional-like setting, that would probably, and there would be obviously discussions with the owners and the applicants about what their intent is and discussions with the city attorney, but when you would look at maybe what the trends are from a market standpoint of what religious institutions are offering in terms of services and housing on more of a campus-like setting, we could be in a position to suggest then that it's a reasonable and customary accessory function to a religious institution to have some component of housing.
Like if they wanted to put an auditorium on it, another section on it, a great big auditorium, and do stuff on that?
Yep. And any new construction is subject to building and site plan review. Now, that's something different than the actual use, as you know, but.
Okay, I just wanted to know what the ramifications are for when you will be switching this over from the residential to the IPS.
Yeah, and the intent here is to do a pretty substantial addition as a phase, and then there long-term another third phase to the project, which includes more religious institutional space. We have not heard from the property owner or the applicant that there's an interest to do residential at this point.
I'm a little confused by even the issue of residential as you just explained it. I pulled up the code, and I don't know if this is kept current back here. But I mean, permitted uses are public or private schools, colleges, and universities, churches, temples, and other places of worship, public libraries, public administrative offices, public utility offices, childcare facilities. That's all that's permitted.
Is that residential?
What? This is under IPS.
IPS.
There's elderly housing as part of that too, under a conditional use grant.
Well, that was unpermitted. What I just read was permitted.
Yes.
I don't see elderly housing in here. Oh yeah, hospitals, nursing and rest homes, and elderly housing. So that is a
But there's no
conditional use.
density standard, there's no FAR,
But it's certainly not it hasn't become a permitted use.
no.
And so the question is, there is at least some discretion left in the council at the time of such an application to determine what's reasonable there.
Right.
Or
It's
not
a
the
conditional
council,
use
excuse me,
grant.
the-
It doesn't
the
require
planning
the
commission
zoning. Yes, I'm sorry. Sorry to interrupt. Conditional use grants can be called up. That is one application from the planning commission that can be called up by the council if there's significant concerns about impact.
Alderman Hawkins.
Kim, your memo states that other churches in the city currently are zoned IPS, and so if they have buildings such as a manse where the pastor and his family live, that manse and other buildings like that would not be taxed, correct?
I don't know. We would have to consult with the assessor. I don't know whether they are or not.
Very specific standards within the tax exemption statute that dictates that for clergy housing, off the top of my head without looking at it, there is, I think, a acreage limitation. It can only be so many acres that are for the assistance of the residential house or something like that, that the language in the statute is. So it could potentially be tax exempt, but they'd have to meet the requirements within the statute. So, just the simple fact that it is housing for a pastor or something like that doesn't in and of itself make it tax exempt unless they meet all of the requirements of the
Okay, so
particular code.
even though these other religious institutions are situated in IPS zoning, they have to meet the requirements that you're referring to in order to get the tax exempt status. So I'm trying to guess what the motivation here is to change the Christchurch zoning from R1 to IPS. They presumably they would have to meet the same standards if they erected a manse on their R1 property. Am I wrong here?
The zoning doesn't dictate whether it's applicable to receive a tax exemption or not.
Are we talking about simply expanding the footprint of the church, let's say?
That is what initiated the proposal.
Okay,
I mean,
okay, all right.
and there's future expansions.
Okay,
so it allows them to. It doesn't require them to go through the conditional use grant
I
process
got you.
every
All
time.
right, so their current R1 zoning, should they want to expand the footprint of the church per se, that would not necessarily meet the tax exemption requirements?
Two separate.
Yeah, I haven't evaluated tax exemption at all as it
All right,
relates to this
So you're talking
property.
about strictly permitting
Yes.
the expansion of the church footprint, which would be a problem in R1?
No, it's not a problem in R1, but it's a different process in which they have to go through. It's a
More
conditional use
burdensome?
grant
Is it more
versus
burdensome?
permitted. So building and site plan review is still required, so there's still authority by the planning commission to look at building placement, height, mass, everything else. One of the other benefits of the institutional zoning and the use is the ability to have some signage facing I-43, and perhaps, the positioning of this parcel to I-43 is one of the advantages to them, although that hasn't.
Thank you.
Okay. We have a motion and a second to approve. Let's call the roll.
Alderman Meyer,
Aye.
Alderman Worth,
Aye.
Alderman Garrell,
Aye.
Alderman Hawkins.
Aye.
Alderman Schneider,
Aye.
Alderman Urban,
Aye.
Alderman Strelchuk,
Aye.
Alderman Bushy.
Aye.
8-0, and that is adopted. Congratulations, gentlemen. Ordinance 1511, amending Chapter 58 of the Mequon Municipal Code as it relates to stormwater management practices for redevelopment projects. This was recommended by the Planning Commission in November, and this is a first reading. Ordinance 1512, amending the city zoning code to rezone the properties located at 6209 West Mequon Road and 110, 50, 11127, 11124 North Industrial Drive from Town Center to Town Center with a PUD planned unit development for a mixed-use development of 13.97 acres. This is the Foxtown project. This was recommended by the Planning Commission in October, and this is a first reading. Moving on to resolutions. Resolution 3483, approving the following in connection with the City of Mequon's insurance program for fiscal year 2018. A contract with Chubb Insurance, Warden, New Jersey, for property casualty insurance in an amount not to exceed $33,000. A contract with Employers Mutual Casualty Insurance, Des Moines, Iowa, for auto, general, law enforcement, workers' compensation, and umbrella liability coverage in the amount of $373,257. This is recommended by Finance Personnel Committee.
I move approval, Resolution 3483.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve. Is there any discussion? Call the roll.
Alderman Worth,
Aye.
Alderman Garrell.
Aye.
Alderman Hawkins.
Aye.
Alderman Schneider,
Aye.
Alderman Urban,
Aye.
Alderman Strelchuk,
Aye.
Alderman Bushy,
Aye.
Alderman Meyer.
Aye.
8-0, and that is adopted. Resolution 3484, renewing an engagement agreement with City Attorney Brian Sajak for the period January 1, 2018 through December 31st, 2020, at an average estimated annual cost of $84,048, and authorizing certain officials to execute the same. This was recommended by the Finance Personnel Committee.
Move to approve.
Second.
Motion second to approve. Call the roll. Alderman Worth.
Sit there, wait. I would like to offer one amendment to the engagement letter And that is that in Section 5, I would like to add as an additional material breach, to be charged with any felony. Whether or not the council is convicted, it sheds a bad light on a community if your attorney is under charges for a felony.
What if he's innocent?
Well, then we'll talk to him afterwards. You don't put yourself in that position.
No running
I don't really buy into having a written agreement in the first place, but if we're going to, we certainly don't want our city attorney to be in a position where he's prosecuting people and what have you while he has whatever nefarious charges pending against him. It's one of the reasons why I don't like contracts with people, because I think you ought to address issues at the time that they occur. But if you're going to insist on contracts, then you ought to make sure that you as the employer have some protection. And I think we'd look awful bad if our city attorney was, had been arrested for rape or murder or what have you, and we're still paying him.
Well,
He's got the look on his face like that's not going to happen.
Well, yeah.
I get the point.
Number 5 says, "And criminal misconduct in office, including violation of the city
In office.
That is different than what he's talking about.
Okay.
I don't have any problems with the suggested addition. As Alderman Strelchek notes, I don't believe that this is a concern that we need to worry about here. But
Plans to run wild?
but nonetheless, I am aware of at least one city official, or not official, but attorney in the area that had charges that were pending, and while those charges were pending, they were effectively suspended from doing their duties.
Well, has the motion been seconded? If not, I'll second it.
Motion and a second to amend Resolution 3484. Any discussion, further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Guess not. Okay, Resolution 3484 as amended. Any
Move to
further
approve.
discussion?
We've got a motion already.
A motion and a second, call the roll.
Alderman Garrow.
Aye.
Alderman Hawkins.
Aye.
Alderman Schneider.
Aye.
Alderman Nurbin.
Aye.
Alderman Strelchek.
Aye.
Alderman Bushy.
Aye.
Alderman Meyer.
Aye.
Alderman Worth.
Aye.
8-0, and that is approved. Resolution 3485, establishing the 2018 compensation plan for non-represented employees and authorizing a transfer of funds in an amount not to exceed $75,000 from the contingency account to various department accounts in the general fund. This was recommended by the Finance Personnel Committee.
Move to approve.
Second.
Motion to approve, motion and a second to approve. Is there any discussion? Alderman Girol.
Yeah, about, 3.5 years ago when I ran for alderman my first term, one of the things people really wanted in the city, our taxpayers wanted a voice, some type of a voice. And I did a lot of research on this, and we went through this at Finance and Personnel back under Lee Zamborski. And we talked about some type of feedback from the residents. Businesses always ask their clients, their customers, how are we doing? And you give them feedback, and then they improve. And that's the way you improve. I had brought forth to the city administrator and to Lee Zamborski ways to do this for the merit-based pay system. And what we came back with was a closed loop. No resident input whatsoever. In fact, the residents are forced to pay taxes. It's a monopoly. And not to include them in and get their feedback and their information. I think is wrong. Because now they're forced to whatever the closed loop of city employees, rating city employees says the performance is. The residents have no say. You don't even look at them or ask them, and a lot of them have problems with the city. In fact, I heard another instance of a few of them that they have plenty of problems with the city. But if you don't listen to them and you don't get their input from them, and it was simple to do, and then turn around and tax them and say, look, we're doing a great job. Look what a great job we're doing. You get no resident input. I'm not going to vote for this. I'm for what we agreed to about the pay raise, but to go forward, this is a merit-based pay system based on an evaluation system where the department head rates those beneath them. It's a closed loop. The residents have no say in it. So I was elected to serve the residents of my community, and that's what I'm going to do, and I'm still going to argue for this. And I think it's quite a bureaucracy when you've worked on something for 3.5 years and brought it up again and again and again, and then you then you use your human resources person that you hired in order to come up with this, and it's just another questionnaire. So I'm disappointed, very disappointed that this is a merit-based pay system that we came up with after all this time that includes nothing, no input whatsoever from the residents. So that's all I have to say on it. I'll definitely vote against it, and I'm very dissatisfied.
Any further discussion? Call the roll.
Alderman Hawkins?
No.
Alderman Schneider?
Yes.
Alderman Nurbin?
Aye.
Alderman Stralchek?
Aye.
Alderman Bushy?
No.
I'm sorry.
No.
Alderman Meyer?
Aye.
Alderman Worth?
Aye.
Alderman Garrow?
No.
5-3.
5-3, and the resolution is adopted. Resolution 3487, adopting a relocation order authorizing the use of eminent domain to acquire sanitary sewer easements and the execution of a professional services agreement with Single Source, Brookfield, Wisconsin, for the estimated amount of $12,600 in connection with the East Trunk Sewer Capacity Expansion Project. This was recommended by the Sewer Utility District Commission. Need a
Move
motion?
approval.
Second.
Motion and second to approve. Is there any discussion? Call the roll.
Alderman Schneider?
Aye.
Alderman Nurbin?
Aye.
Alderman Stralchek?
Aye.
Alderman Bushy?
Aye.
Alderman Meyer?
Aye.
Alderman Worth?
Aye.
Alderman Garrow?
Aye.
Alderman Hawkins?
Aye.
8-0, and that's adopted. Resolution 3488, ratifying the award of a contract for 2017 sanitary sewer manhole rehabilitation work to the Musan Brothers Incorporated of Brookfield, Wisconsin, in the amount of $71,685, recommended by the Sewer Utility District.
Recommend approval.
Second.
A motion and a second. Any discussion? Call the roll.
Alderman Nurbin?
Aye.
Alderman Stralchek?
Aye.
Alderman Bushy?
Aye.
Alderman Meyer?
Aye.
Alderman Worth?
Aye.
Alderman Garrow?
Aye.
Alderman Hawkins?
Aye.
Alderman Schneider?
Aye.
8-0, and that's adopted. Item 9, specified unfinished business, has already been taken care of. We have no petitions, memorials, remonstrances, or communications. Specified miscellaneous new business, appointment of 2018-2019 election inspectors.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve. Is there any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Item
Move to
12.
adjourn.
Second.
Motion and second to adjourn. All in favor say aye.
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 Yes, we are adjourned.
At a reasonable